Boa noite, galera. bem-vindos todos, bem-vindas todas ao Zup Open Talks. Hoje é uma edição, para mim, pessoalmente, mais que especial, para a gente falar de uma coisa que eu amo, que mudou minha vida, que eu já contei isso algumas vezes, que é o Open Source. E a gente trouxe um convidado extremamente especial hoje, é um dos pioneiros de Open Source no mundo, ele foi vice-presidente de Open Source da Sun, então está por trás de todos os projetos que a Sun fez. Foi criador do laboratório de Java dentro da IBM, é uma pessoa que fez a história do Open Source, tenho o prazer de ter ele como meu amigo pessoal nos últimos anos. Então hoje quem está com a gente aqui no Open Talks é o Simon Phipps. Recadinhos paroquiais, se inscrevam no nosso canal aí para não perder nenhum outro Zup Open Talks, está tudo ficando gravado, pode mandar para as pessoas que não puderam estar aqui ao vivo com a gente hoje. Um outro aviso importante é que a Zup está com diversas vagas abertas, então, por favor, entre no nosso site, principalmente se você é um baita programador Java, a gente tem muita oportunidade boa para você, para crescer exponencialmente dentro da Zup, então dá uma olhada no nosso site, e também não esquecendo de falar dos nossos projetos Open Source, opensource.zup.com.br, recebi várias mensagens ao longo do dia perguntando do Hacktoberfest. Sim, nós estaremos participando do Hacktoberfest com os projetos Open Source da Zup, e a gente tem até uma surpresa especial no Hacktoberfest, mas aí, começando o Hacktoberfest, a gente conversa com todo mundo. Então, eu vou mudar agora para inglês, para poder chamar o Simon. Vocês podem mandar as perguntas em português ou inglês, eu vou agrupar todas e fazer com ele depois, tá bom? So, now I want to invite my friend Simon Phipps. Good
Hello.
night, Simon.
Good evening.
Good evening. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to have you here. I know it's pretty late on England right now, and I'm really happy and excited to have you here. So thank you so much for being so kind to attend our invitation.
It's my pleasure. It's good to see you, and I'm just looking in the chat and seeing all sorts of old friends showing up in the chat as well. And I apologize that despite starting a Brazilian Portuguese course at least 10 years ago, I still can only get as far as boa noite. So my
yeah, but it's perfect. So, my friend, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Well, really, I would much rather have a conversation with Jomar and see what questions people have got. But I want to start off by talking about a concept that I've been working through with a number of clients recently. And that is to ask the question about why open source works. I find a lot of conversations that happen about open source start from the perspective that we all understand why it's good and how it works. And we then focus on details like licensing or governance or community structure or the value of the code or the business model. And we forget to make sure everyone has understood what it is that makes the open source network effect actually function. So that's what I want to talk about first of all before we get into a conversation. And that's why this section is called No Need to Ask. It's about discovering that what makes open source work is the freedom to go ahead and do stuff without having to negotiate with anybody. Now, you did hear a little bit just then about what I've done. Just a synopsis for you here. I have been working in tech for quite a long time now. I think nearly 40 years. I've always lived in the UK. I have been very blessed indeed to be to just happen to be in the same place where parts of the history of computing have been unfolding. So I did that at Unisys, just as PCs were beginning to happen and as workstations were moving into business. I did that at IBM, where I was able to work on video conferencing and then to work on establishing the Java business at IBM, and then on getting XML going at IBM. And then I moved to Sun Microsystems, and I worked there for nearly 10 years on open source software, and in particular on getting Java open source, and then getting the rest of Sun's portfolio open source. And then it turned out when Oracle bought Sun, for some reason they didn't want an open source officer, And so I moved from there to private enterprise, helped start a company called ForgeRock that took Sun's open source identity management software and made a business out of it. And then since then, I've been an independent consultant and entrepreneur. I was mentioning to Jomar that I've actually got out of tech most recently and got into the restaurant business, but we can talk about that in the conversation later. I'm still consulting for a lot of companies, and in particular, I've been working on projects for the European Commission recently. And that's where this question of, why do people want open source has come from? Because it turns out that people do want open source. The desire for it is absolutely everywhere. I don't quite know why that is, but everyone wants to do open source. Now, its origins go a long way back into the past. The origins of open source were right back in the 1970s and 1980s. As software became something that was independent of the computer it ran on, the expectation of access to the source code carried on as well. And around about the time that IBM was having a struggle with the American government over its dominance and monopoly over the computer industry, there was a thing called the consent decree where IBM agreed to unbundle software from hardware. And that happened at around about the same time that the software industry was beginning to evolve. And in the US, on the East and the West Coast, there was a movement to make sure the source code remained available for the software. On the West Coast, and you'll see over there the gentleman on the left of the slide, that's Bill Joy. Bill Joy was the primary author and constructor of Berkeley Systems Distribution, which was a collection of tools that revolved around Unix, and then became a Unix kernel as well that went with those tools. And that software was released in such a way that everybody was free to do whatever they wanted with it, really without asking permission from anyone and without having to take any other action to justify their use. The way I summarized the licensing there was you were free to do whatever you wanted with their brilliant stuff as long as you didn't come back and ask for help. And then on the East Coast, a gentleman called Richard Stallman was struggling with the decreasing availability of the software that was needed to keep his lab working, particularly some printer drivers. And he became the founder of a line of computing that wanted to maintain the freedoms that he assumed he should have and make sure they were passed on to the recipients of his software, and that those recipients pass the same freedoms on to the people that got software from them too. So the open source movement today flows from both of these roots. People sometimes mistakenly believe that it's all about Stallman, but Stallman and Joy were contemporaries, and they were both building on a history that preceded them of the expectation of availability of source code. Stallman, however, came up with a really quite brilliant way of talking about what those freedoms were. And he came up with what were called the four freedoms. The four freedoms don't sound quite right when you talk about them, because they have the idea of sharing software cropping up twice. And so I tend to put the four freedoms this way. I say that they are the freedom to use, to study, to improve, and to share the software. That's the freedom to use it for any purpose, the freedom to study the source code and understand how it works, the freedom to improve it any way you wish, and the freedom to share the original code and the improvements with anyone that you want to. And that set of freedoms lie right at the root of the entire open source movement and the free software movement as well. Of course, in Brazil, you don't suffer from the same struggle that us people who only speak English suffer from, because you have the idea of livre and gratis. But in English, the word free means both livre and gratis. And so people get terribly hung up on the fact that the software shouldn't cost anything, when what they should be worrying about is whether they have the freedom to use it or not. And so that's where the conflict between free software and open source comes from in the English language. I suggest in Portuguese you stick to software livre and don't get into código aberto at all, and just stick with software livre, because they mean the same thing. They're all about the freedom to use the software for any purpose. So in the phrase open source, the question then arises of what the word open means, because we use the word open in English to talk about the software rather than using the word free, because English-speaking people get hung up on the price if you use the word free. The word open, used in the sense of open source, means that the work product, the software, can be used, improved, and shared for any purpose without obstruction and without required negotiation. Now, when you see that word open anywhere, whether it's in connection with open data, open hardware, open government, whatever kind of open it is, it's used to mean the same thing. That word open must mean that the work product can be used, improved, and shared by the recipient for any purpose at all that they want, and without any kind of hidden obstructions, or importantly, without any negotiation. If you want to find what the magic of open source is about, it's that word there. It's the word negotiation. What makes open source work is that there isn't any negotiation required. It does not require you to go to any rights holder to pay royalties. You don't have to pay for any licenses or acquire any licenses. You don't have to get written permission. You don't have to join an association. You don't have to do anything to be able to use or distribute the software. And that is right at the heart of what the word open means when we say open source. And that's why I believe that open source and free software are the same thing. I believe that open means that you have the right to proceed without negotiating. And that's essentially the summary of the law and the prophets, if you will. It is the summary of the 4 freedoms in one word: is no need to negotiate. And so that brings about a great deal of change in the way that you approach software. Because let's say I tell you that my software is available without charge, that it's free, that it's gratis. The difficulty there is, in order to rely on that, you need to trust me. And you can never trust corporations. Brian Cantrell, who I worked with at Sun, put it this way. He said that a corporation doesn't love you or hate you. It's like a lawnmower for cutting your grass. When you put your hand in, your hand gets cut off, not because the lawnmower hates you, but because it's a lawnmower. It cuts everything. And that's how corporations are too. Corporations are systems for creating revenue. That's what a corporation is. And a system for creating revenue will monetize whatever you put in front of it. And so if you say only that something is free of charge, or you say it is given away without there being any legal wrapper that creates freedoms there, eventually somebody will come and use that ability to take money out of you and stop you. So the magic that open source has done, and the magic that free software has done, the magic of software livre, is that magic of the word open liberating you from the need to negotiate with anybody. No negotiation means no asking permission. It means no delay. It means no hesitation. It means that the network effect of free software and open source and software livre is unlocked. That's what unlocks it for you. It removes all of the obstacles out of your way for innovating and standing on the shoulders of the giants who preceded you to produce more and greater things. That phrase, use, study, improve, share, is summed up in the idea of no negotiation. Now, that may sound like I'm giving you a talk all about Richard Stallman's 4 freedoms. I just want to emphasize that these 4 words, use, study, improve, and share, are at the heart of the business proposition of open source software. The word use, for example, the word use indicates that you can let adoption lead your use of the software, because you haven't got to pay for licenses in advance. You haven't got to agree a commercial basis before you start. You can just give it a try and see what happens. That lets you fail early, so that you're not tied up in the decision to use the software. You can just taste something, and if it's good, you can cook with it, and if it's not good, you can throw it away. And that in turn means that as a software user, you retain flexibility over your budget, because using software is not the same thing as having a contract with a supplier. That freedom to use the software for any purpose unlocks those benefits. The freedom to study means you can hire from an open market in expertise. It means you can develop expertise in-house to any level without being forced to have a certification or a training course from your supplier. It means that you can have people in your company who understand the product intimately and can get you through a crisis. The freedom to improve. That means that there can be a rich marketplace surrounding your code, and a rich marketplace from which it's possible to then pick add-ons, to see new innovations coming in. When you look at products from proprietary suppliers who have closed their source code, you find there are barriers to innovation, because to innovate and start a new business, you first have to negotiate a relationship with the rights holder. But with open source, there's no barriers to that. And so all sorts of unexpected innovation can flow in all directions out of the product. And then sharing. Open source software can be deployed without barriers. It's this that made the cloud possible. It simply wouldn't have been possible to do cloud computing with something where you had to buy enough licenses for every instance you were going to launch before you got started. It's this that's made IoT possible. It means you can have a thing embedded in every bigger thing, and you haven't got to track them and make sure that you've paid the rights and licenses for each of the bits. It's what makes partner ecosystems possible around open source software without having a controlling spider at the top of the web. And in terms of government usage, it means that citizens and clients and customers can use whatever software is necessary, and not to have a third-party relationship with a software supplier to join in with the systems that you're rolling out. I would say that the first derivative of software freedom is business value, that they're intimately connected to one another like that. And that if we didn't know better, we'd actually pay extra for open source software. In the end, open source software is about liberty. It is about being able to proceed without having to ask permission before you do. And that's a different thing to free in price. So I've got a picture here from New York Harbor. In the background, there are the dock cranes of New Jersey. In the foreground is the Statue of Liberty. They're both in the same posture, but it would be impossible to confuse them with each other. So in summary, why open source works is ultimately because software freedom triggers the network effect. It isn't down to licensing per se. It goes back a layer to the point where the need to ask permission is taken away. I'd therefore suggest to you that software freedom is at the origin of the business values of open source. Now, I say this to you because as you're putting together a strategy for a business, or for an open source program office, or for a line of hardware that depends on open source software, as you're building a career around open source, it's crucially important that you don't lose sight of the fact that software freedom is the origin. I hear so many people who think that open source is somehow a phrase that they can use independently of that meaning. I hear people, for example, trying to talk about business open source or commercial open source, where it's just a marketing phrase, and there's no consideration of extending freedom to the customer. I hear people talking about open source in standard settings, where they believe that open source simply means people coming together to discuss things in an open forum, but still being able to retain the right to charge patent royalties downstream. And it's crucial that people hold on to the fact that software freedom is the anchor point. It is the foundation stone of the business values that you're looking for. And to benefit from open source, you need to have a strategic vision and a tactical process that takes that into account. And if your open source strategy doesn't somewhere talk about guaranteeing software freedom for us and for our customers, then what you're doing, I'm sorry, is not open source. It's nothing to do with it. So that was all I was going to say. I could go further than that, because I hear the word open being used about open data, about open hardware. I hear it being used about open patents. Tesla talks about its open patent portfolio. And I actually don't think the word open is very well used in each of those places. But we'll let that come out in the conversation somewhere. Happy to talk to you about whatever you want to at this point, Jomar, and everyone in the chat room as well. So back to you. How was that? That was half an hour. There we go.
Yeah, that's perfect, Simon. Thank you so much. And I think you managed to put in so many simple words in a short time, much more information that maybe people could start reading today. They will end up in a year trying to put all the pieces together. So thank you so much. It's really, really impressive. And guys, please send me your questions on the chat, and we can start talking. But I have a very few to start with, Simon. One thing that people used to ask me a lot about open source is why should they open the source code of their existing software projects? And I've heard this from entrepreneurs, sometimes from developers. And recently we had a roundtable with entrepreneurs in Brazil. And it was funny, the CEO of our company was there, but the purpose behind the scenes of opening the source code of every single company was totally different. Mm-hmm. So what are general advice you give to entrepreneur why he should open the source code of his project?
Right. Well, so I wouldn't suggest that absolutely everything has got to be open source, because maintaining an open source project does come with a cost. First of all, you have to hire smarter people. You can't afford to have second-rate programmers working on open source software. Because they have to interact with other smart programmers, and they can't just hide behind the anonymity of an internal version control system. It also has a greater cost, because you do then have to explain what you're doing to people who don't work for you, and that all takes time. That all takes effort. So having said that, when I'm talking to entrepreneurs about these things, the first thing I say is, well, do they really want to maintain that code forever? Do they want to build into their business plan the maintenance of all the code that they're working? Because as you build a software platform, every line of code you write, you need to have a test plan for, and you need to have unit tests, and you need to have a test plan, and you may all be doing it with automation now, but still the test portfolio gradually grows, and the responsibility of looking after it gradually grows. And when you use open source properly, when you build a community around it, you spread the burden of maintenance across all the other people who are benefiting from it. And so you're then free to focus more of your investment in software engineering on innovation rather than purely on maintenance. And I think that's the point of origin. The next point that I'd make to people is that they're actually almost certainly using open source anyway. it's very unlikely that the software systems that lie beneath their work are all completely proprietary. They're almost certainly using a pile of Apache code. They're using a load of frameworks, some of which have come, they may not even realize they're using all this code from Facebook and all this code that has been created by a bunch of other companies they didn't think were software suppliers. And the boundary line at the bottom of their stack where they would need to take an interest is kind of missable. There's a soft boundary. And you find at the bottom layer, you will want to engage with the source code of your platform and of the frameworks that you're using. And if that's of value to you, you have to then ask, why did Facebook make React.js open source? It's a very powerful, rich environment. Why did they make it open source? Well, they made it open source so that they could stop caring about it. They still use it. They actually have an internal fork of the public project now, and they cherry pick from the public project the things that they want to put into theirs. But they've built this community that does the maintenance and the innovation for them, and they're able to focus on something else. And so I will say to the entrepreneur, so how much of your code do you think you could do that with? You're going to have to build these clever things, but they're not the thing that differentiates your business. Why don't you make those things open source, let a community form around them, and let innovation come unexpectedly from elsewhere? So I think those would be the points that I would probably want to make if I was looking at people. Open source is about a shared maintenance. It's about unexpected innovation. And then the third thing you get from it is what we were trying to go for at Sun in many occasions. You build a community of adoption that you can monetize. And when you have open source for your stack of componentry and open source toolkits associated with your hardware or your products, you build an ecosystem of people who want to interact with you. Very long answer.
No, but it's perfect. I remember Sun used to distribute a small book, a brochure, explaining why Sun was working with open source. And I think part of that was talking about the ability to capture innovation wherever it was. So if I'm not making a mistake between this and a presentation that I saw, there was an executive from Sun. I don't remember if it was.
It was Bill Joy.
Bill Joy said that it doesn't matter the size of your company. Outside is always bigger than inside.
We always used to sum that up as you can't hire all the best people. Inevitably, the majority of the smartest people don't work for you.
Yeah, and this is really, really impressive. So I'm going to some of the audience questions. I think that the one that Bruno asked, you almost answered. I have one from Mari that is with us actually on the backstage. What do you think is the future of open source looking now to 10 to 20 years?
Right. Well, so open source has been progressing pretty much in decade-size slices. And in the first decade, I would say that it was dominated by the thought of substituting proprietary software with free software. And because people were thinking in terms of commercial off-the-shelf software, it was big things that were being swapped in. So that was where, for example, the GIMP came from, was people wanted to swap out PaintShop Pro, as it was then, and swap in a piece of free software, and that was how GIMP arose. When Sun released StarOffice as OpenOffice in when did we do that? 2000 it was, wasn't it? That was very much in the spirit of the first decade of open source. It was a big thing that was released as open source. I think in the second decade, what was increasingly happening was we were seeing the infrastructure beginning to be dominated by open source, and that opened up community behavior to a much broader range of people, because whereas when you were dealing with monolithic or desktop replacement software, you tended not to have the skills to maintain it. Once it got to the server software, many companies had people in-house who had the skills to maintain it, and so communities grew. And now we're in the third decade. We're well into the era where it is componentry and stacks of componentry that are being put together. I think that the future of open source will see more and more of that mix and match of componentry. It will see less and less people trying to monetize open source as is. Because one of the attributes of the first and second decades was you got single product companies coming up that tried to monetize a database or a desktop productivity tool or a thing. Nowadays, open source software is much more a whole load of pieces put together to make a stack, and I think we're going to see that becoming more and more the trend, and we're going to see more and more of the software being maintained by the companies deploying it. And I think that is a big challenge for the open source community, because it means it's going to get harder and harder to maintain things like LibreOffice, or to maintain things like the GIMP or like Scribus, because it will be impossible to run a company to run those things, to monetize those things. And so I think in the next generation of open source, we're going to see more and more charitable non-profit entities that actually make open source software. That may come as a surprise, but at the moment, most of the charities in the open source sector don't make open source software. What they do is they support the people who do. So you look at Apache, for example. The Apache Software Foundation employees do not make any software. What they do is they run the version control system and the websites. They run the conference. They do the press releases and the marketing. But the people who actually work on the code are all paid by other people for the time that they spend on the code. And I think we're going to move away from that. I think we're going to see more of the Mozilla type experience. So Mozilla hire pretty much everybody who shows any talent in working on Mozilla, on the Mozilla browser. And we're going to see more and more of that, I think, of people forming not-for-profit companies that maintain the things that we need for our desktop on a charitable basis. And we'll see then more of component-based stacks being built by the other half of the open source community. I think that's going to be the trend that will follow on in the next decade.
Okay, great. Fernando Ike asked something that I think is pretty important, and it's the second point of confusion for most people I've been talking, not only here in Brazil, but what are the things you recommend for people to take a very, very deep look when they choose a license for an open source project?
Well, so you've got to remember that an open source license plays a different role to a commercial license. So commercial licenses are a peace treaty. They are the bilateral agreement between two corporations. And you'll remember corporations don't love you or hate you. Okay. And so you can't trust corporations because they don't have a heart. And so when two corporations come together, they need an agreement between them to arbitrate how they're going to handle the good times and the bad times. And so when we think about licenses, we often think about licenses in those terms. They're the rules, the crisis resolution. Now, in an open source community, that isn't what the license does. What the license does is it describes what Eben Moglen once called the constitution of the community. It's the expected norms that the community will proceed with. So a community that adopts the Apache license is a community whose expected norm is that people will be able to take the code proprietary. They will be able to embed it in other projects. They will not need to pay royalty fees. They will contribute back voluntarily. Whereas a community that adopts the GNU General Public License is a community that has got different norms. It's got norms that say you'll make sure that all the things you produce with this software are also licensed under the GPL. So their recipients have the same freedoms you enjoy. The GPL says we expect you to contribute back to the project. And so you pick your license based on the norms of your community. If the license is flowing out of your business context, you pick them to reflect your business model. And that's where the bad practice comes from in license selection. You see companies trying to find the maximally scary open source license to put on their code so that they can claim to be open source, but nobody will be brave enough to actually start their own business with that code. And so a lot of companies use the AGPL for that at the moment. And even the AGPL turns out not to be scary enough for some people. And so companies like MongoDB have moved away from it and are now using even more scary licenses that can't be called open source because they're so toxic. So the license you're going to pick are going to be the licenses that reflect the values and needs of your community and that reflect the values and needs of your business model. And that's a very, that's not the specific answer people might be wanting. What that boils down to, though, is that most people have got if their business model is about getting the code embedded in other things, they'll be using a license, they'll be using the Apache license. And if their business model is about building a community, they'll be using the GNU General Public License or the Mozilla license or the Eclipse license. And if those don't work for you, you've probably got your plan wrong, honestly.
Yeah.
There may be 80 other licenses, but about 75 of them you don't need.
Yeah, and talking about community, there are a lot of questions regarding community around projects. So what do you think are the best practices to build a community around an open source project? What kind of activities people can do, initiatives like the Hacktoberfest, and what is your biggest advice on this to build a community around an open source project?
So there's really one fundamental thing to build a community, and that is to realize that it's what Apache call community over code. We're discussing it in the LibreOffice community at the moment, and we're describing it as a project over product. It is to say that the people who should matter to you in your community are the people who contribute to the community, and not the people who use its work product. If you give too much voice to the people who consume the work product of your community, you'll begin to alienate the people who actually contribute to it. And so when you're working out what your community should do, that is your straight measuring line. It is the line that you run across all of your proposals and say, is this for the project or is this for the product? Is this for the code or is this for the community? And if it's for the community, it's probably right. And if it's for the code, it's probably the wrong choice. Beyond there, forming a community is actually a very complicated task that has some different rules at scale to the rules that it has at initiation. So to get something started, you need a group of people who trust each other, and you need an environment where there are no secrets. As you grow to scale, you gradually discover that making things too democratic is itself toxic. And so designing a community that is going to work both on the small scale of starting and establishing and growing, and is also going to work on the scale of maturity and a group of people who've never met each other and a global reach, those are two completely different tasks. If you're growing a community and you're asking the question that you asked, Jomar, I suggest you stick with transparency, openness, democracy, making sure that there are no secrets kept from anybody, making sure everybody has the same freedoms. But be aware that as you grow, one day you're going to reach the point where those things harm you more than they help you.
Yeah, so amazing, and this is really useful. And I remember the old days when LibreOffice started. We tried to do something about that fork, but I think we failed. But anyway, LibreOffice won at the end, and that there was a huge lesson learned there. Also, one other thing that that is quite interesting to me. The way we are doing our open source projects here on Zup, we are taking a lot of care about the documentation. So how do you see the impact of good documentation for open source projects in general?
Right. So I have to confess to you that I'm very much a documentation skeptic. I believe that the very best documentation gets written with the code, and that any documentation that isn't written with the code is out of date, just as a, as a matter of reality. And I'm always very skeptical about out of date documentation being used for anything. So I think for an open source projects are documenting everything in the process of the development of the software. So every time someone changes the software, there is a commit, and that commit contains sufficient data for the rest of the community to believe that that commit was a good idea. And I think that if you're going to have a documentation process, it should, as far as possible, flow from the code. I think that was actually one of the most brilliant things that we ever did with Java, honestly. JavaDoc and putting all the documentation in a way that could be machine processed into the source code was simply the most brilliant thing that happened in Java. You might think other things were more brilliant, but I'm very keen on that. I'm also very keen on that because that meant that on the day that we licensed Java under the GPL, we also licensed the documentation under the GPL. And so whatever any big company starting with O might tell you, the Java specification has been available without needing to license it from them ever since we released it under the GPL, as long as you use the GPL version and not something else.
Okay. We have some other questions here. I'm trying to group them. So the other one is much more related with people that never worked with open source. They are watching this video right now. They are understanding how big this could be or how big this should be in the future. And what are the initial steps you recommend for those guys that are already programmers to start working? And by the way, one thing that I've noticed about the status of open source, I thought it was only in Brazil, but I talked to friends in different countries. I just had a conversation with a guy from Italy, for instance, and he said it's mostly the same situation. When we started talking about open source, at least in Brazil, 10 to 15 years ago, it looked like we are a bunch of crazy guys with the mind out of the place, trying to convince the world that was possible to do all those things in a collaborative, free of charge way. And we struggled a lot to let's say explain this vision. But when we see how things are today, I just saw on the Linux Foundation event that there is estimative that only 20% of the commercial applications today is really company developed code. Like 80%, if you include the infrastructure and the libraries, as you mentioned, it's open source. So what I realize is that I know people today that only worked with open source software their whole professional lives. So guys that started working with programming in the past 10 years or so, basically everything they touch it, everything they use it is open source. So they have this idea of open, but it's not a clear view as you presented earlier. But for talking to them, I feel that they don't have this sense of ownership of the projects. So it's like I have a fridge, I have beer that is free, and I have beer that I need to pay for. So I'll try the free one first, and if it's really crappy, I can pay for the other one. But they don't get this sense of ownership. So to summarize all this, how we can put this sense of ownership or try to create this sense of ownership among the programmers that already work with open source but don't have this sense of ownership. And for the people that want to start contributing, which I believe it's the same, how they should start.
Right.
working?
But the second question is easier because getting started in most big open source projects these days, there's usually a program in place to help you get started. So take the LibreOffice project, which I'm very familiar with. They have on the wiki, they have a webpage called Easy Hacks. And you can go there and you can find small tasks that you don't have to be a lifetime programmer to be able to do. They may be very simple things like looking for untranslated strings or reformatting code or updating user interface elements, but they're valuable things that will result in you needing to make a commit into the repository and becoming established as a contributor, and they start you on the road. I think that the most important thing to working with open source is to start working with open source. That sounds very trivial, but you look at the code base and you look at the people who are contributing, and what they're doing seems to be very difficult. In some cases, it is really difficult. Contributing to some Apache projects, you have got to work out how to create diff files and how to submit them to a mailing list and how to justify your submission. But many other places are using Git, and you're able to use the tools to make the patch submission, and you're able to submit them on a site like GitLab or GitHub that uses a pull request. And you're able to just get started. And the chances are that most projects will want your submission if it isn't completely stupid. And it's very likely that if you try something, that your submission will be accepted. And hey, then you've become a programmer and you're now working on open source. And once you've tried a little piece, you'll find it's addictive, that you want more, that you'll want a bigger pinch, you'll want a longer line to sniff. And you'll find yourself wanting more and more of that feeling that I just contributed something to the project. And so I think the golden rule with open source, with getting into open source, is start with something, the smallest thing you can manage, and the act of doing that will find people who want to mentor you. It will find people who want what you do. It will get your name in the repository, and it will establish your reputation. When it comes to getting people to feel a sense of ownership for their code, I think that it's really difficult to answer how you do that. I think that people do need to develop the expectation that the code that they work on is going to be code they can look at, and I think they need to give people a lot of grief if they're put into an employment position where they can't look at the code that they rely on. And honestly, over the last few years, everyone I know that programs has got that attitude already. Why do I want to work on something that makes my life difficult? Why do I want to work on software that gets in my way? The biggest challenge is people learning to take the obstacles away without actually giving you the freedom. And I think that's the big thing that worries me most about the future of open source, is people who've learned to fake it. But in terms of giving people that sense of ownership, I think people have got that already. It's called not tolerating people standing in your way. And I think that people have just instinctively got it at the moment.
Okay, great. And there's another few questions regarding big companies and corporations around open source. How do you see today the role of companies like Microsoft, Oracle, Google, the big techs? How do you see their role on the current open source ecosystem? I know you mentioned Facebook too.
Yeah, well, so those are three companies who are completely unlike each other. And you mentioned Oracle there as well, and they are completely unlike the other three. Generally speaking, Google has been a good actor for its entire life when it comes to open source software. People do criticize them for retaining too much control around Android. I tend to answer that back by saying, if Google really controlled Android, Amazon wouldn't be using it in the Kindle. And Amazon are using it in the Kindle, and so a Kindle Fire is just an Android device with no Android on it. And so I think Google has generally made pragmatic choices, but they've contributed a massive amount to open source. They've contributed a great deal of open source code to the outside world, and they've generally been a good actor. Apple less so. Apple have had more of an attitude that the kind of the BSD worldview that says, look at my fantastic code, and you can use this part, but don't bother me. And Apple has also stayed away from letting their real innovations escape out as open source. But on the other hand, Apple they've been a good friend in many ways. We probably wouldn't have cups at the moment if Apple hadn't stepped in to look after it in the way that they did. And Apple has been a fine contributor in the BSD community for a long time. So that's all pretty good. Now, Microsoft is a very interesting case, because what's happened in Microsoft is that I don't know if you've read The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. But in The Innovator's Dilemma, Clayton Christensen explains how businesses, as they mature, they focus on higher and higher value customers, and they leave behind the low value customers not being loved by the company anymore. And small companies come in with value propositions targeted at the low value customers, and that's called disrupting the business of the established incumbent. And what Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma is that as you become a bigger, more successful company, you plant the seeds of your own destruction by abandoning the small at the level of the market where you were introduced. Now, what Microsoft has done to deal with that is they have realized that old Microsoft actually was toxic, and they have allowed a new company to spring up inside their business called Azure. And they have made old Microsoft the servant of the new Azure. And the new Azure's business is utterly dependent on open source, because their cloud business relies on open source for the stack, for the framework at every level, even for the operating system. And so Microsoft has had to reinvent itself as the servant of the Azure startup that started at the low end of their business. And the consequence of that is today, Microsoft is at least as fine a contributor and friend to open source as Apple and Google are. However, their legacy is one that us old people with the grey beards remember. We remember the utterly toxic Microsoft, and we're kind of slow to forget it and slow to forgive it. Now, I did have a conversation with an executive at Microsoft about this, and I recommended that they apologize. And that is indeed what they've done. They have apologized. They apologized for having Balmer calling Linux a cancer. They apologized for their criticism of the GPL. They apologized for their previous attitudes. Honestly, I think the little residual bits of old Microsoft that are embedded in the company rather apologize through gritted teeth. But the new Microsoft really is utterly dependent on open source for its business and is driving the old Microsoft to do good. So in all of those places, I see companies whose they're corporations. They don't have hearts, they don't do good things, but they're in the control of people who understand that it's in the company's interests to use, contribute to, and cultivate open source. And as a consequence, I respect them a great deal for that. I have a lot less respect for Oracle, but I probably shouldn't talk about
that. Yeah, and talking about apologies, I was thinking on they owe me an apology about OpenXML, but I think that when they joined me on the ODFTC, and they did quite a very good job at the time. So I think this was a good way of make an official apology.
I'll tell you one other thing that's happened. So I started a not-for-profit company about 5 years ago. And one of the things that I did was I started a project called the COSM Project. So I'll just share that. Where are we? Let's see if I can share that for people. Share screen and Chrome tab and there. That one. So here's a remarkable thing that happened. We started this thing called the COSM project. COSM stands for the Community of ODF maintainers, And we decided that the ODF standard wasn't being maintained properly at Oasis because IBM had pulled out. IBM could no longer use ODF as a stick to beat Microsoft, which was the only thing they cared about. And so they pulled all their people out of it, and they disappeared from the OpenOffice project, and they also disappeared from the ODF-TC almost overnight. And that meant there was no one editing the standard, and that meant the new release of the standard couldn't come out. And so I started this project to crowdfund maintenance of the ODF standard. And so the new release of ODF 1.3, which has just recently come out, was paid for by a group of stakeholders who all chipped in a little bit of money to pay an editor. And the very first contribution I had was from the Document Foundation. The second donation I had was from Microsoft.
Whoa.
And Microsoft donated because they are dependent on ODF, because they're now one of the most faithful implementers of the ODF standard within the Office product range. And consequently, they're dependent on it. They show up at the TC. And I remember the beginning of ODF in 2002, two people from Microsoft at Oasis scorning our activity and telling us we were wasting our time and refusing to come to the meeting. So it was a special blessing nearly 15 years later to have Microsoft be the first for-profit donor to the ODF maintenance project.
Yeah, I must say that I'm really impressed, because I think I got away from the ODF around 2011. I think I was there when 1.2 was approved, because it was a version that I was able to contribute and to work with, and it was a pleasure. It was a very, very good time. I learned a lot, and I'm quite impressed about this. And yes, in the end, their implementation is quite good, and they helped a lot. I worked with them on digital signatures, and this was an area where we really had problems, basically on interoperability in the past. And Simon, a final question: as you're talking about ODF, there's other thing that people don't. I feel like it's something that I've stopped doing, and I'm regretting that. That is talking about open standards, because it's again the same story all over again. 15 years ago, we need to explain what was open standards for people to adopt it, and today almost all things are based on open standards. So how do you see the current open standards development environment and the role of the open source people on those developments?
So that one of the things that I'm now doing for, as you know, one of my clients, as it were, is actually the Open Source Initiative, where I'm helping them as their director of standards and policy. And so I'm now attending standards groups again. Now, back in 2005, OSI came up with this thing, the open standards requirement for software. And this arose out of conflict between the de jure standards world and the open source software world. And while we were discussing that conflict, we came up with this thing, the OSR, that explains that for software, for a standard to be implementable as open source, it has to comply with these 5 criteria. And that kind of settled the discussion. And nobody really worried about open source and open standards from 2005 until around about 2015. And around about that point, suddenly the war erupted again, like a border dispute between 2 tribes of the same family. You know, it just came back again out of nowhere. And the reason for that was because the industries that were reliant on 5G began to realize that they weren't going to be able to demand royalties from the software community on 5G if they didn't do something to fix open source. And so around about that time, some companies who I could name for you, but I won't do it here on the podcast, started a coordinated and well-funded effort to begin to try and undermine open source as it's generally understood. they began to say things like, it's, open source is only about copyright licensing. Well, open source is not only about copyright licensing. Open source is about making sure that you have all the permissions you need so you don't have to negotiate. That's what open source is about. And so these companies, and in particular their legal representatives, have been going to standards groups and trying to persuade them to redefine open source internally in places like Etsy and DIN and ISO, and make open source just be about copyright licensing, so that these companies who make silicon chips and who make radio equipment can continue to claim that yes, we have open source. Oh, but you owe us a load of royalties too. And so once again, after over 10 years, we once again need people who understand open source active in the standards world. And it's very relevant and important, because we're also seeing a world where international trade treaties are up for grabs again. We're seeing these standards bodies beginning to be in a position where they can define norms, and beginning to be in a position where they can define trade treaties that would make open source impossible. So I've long felt that open source and open standards were that they were the same problem seen by different worlds. And because open standards started long before open source, there has been time for regulatory capture to happen. Regulatory capture is where the criminals take over the police force. And regulatory capture is what has happened very extensively in the world of open standards. Open standards were originally supposed to be about making sure that the vendors could not create a cartel that controlled the markets that they were addressing. And open standards have become a vehicle for legal cartels to control the industries that they serve. And the open source world really needs to step in and stop that happening to open source. Because when I look at open hardware and open data, I see the same loss of compass. I see in open data, people have forgotten that open means an open work product, not just open access to the materials. I see that in open hardware, people have forgotten that open means leaving something open for your customers, as well as leaving something open for the people who create the product. And so in open hardware and open data, we don't see any of the same propagation of liberties through society. And we see people then being free to think that they can monetize other people's work. So I think now more than ever, we need to see open source people involved in open standards. And we also need to see people going into the open data world and saying open means an open work product, not an open workforce. We need to see people go into the open standards world and tell them open doesn't mean an open committee, it means an open work product. We need to see people going into open hardware and having them say open hardware doesn't mean you are open to strip mine the resources of the community. It needs to mean that you have made what you make open to the community. And in all of those places, we've forgotten that open means not having to ask. And so that's really, to close the loop on this talk, that's where the title comes from. Open source is still in touch with open meaning not needing to ask. The rest of the opens that I see have lost touch with that, and we need to help them to reconnect.
Okay, Simon. So thank you so much. I know it's quite late there, and but this was amazing. Thank you so much. I think this conversation, I will personally use it to send to anyone that asks me all those questions, because I've been answering the way I can, doing my best, but I'm not that good. And so thank you so much for being here, having this conversation. When the thing on 2015 started happening, I swear you that I spent like one day or so trying to understand what was going on. But thanks God, I was so busy working at that time that I just said, no, I don't need to come back to that place again. Not at this moment. But I've heard some histories recently. During the State of the Source OSI event last week, I was surprised to see one of the directors of Oasis there. I exchanged a couple of messages with him, and I felt that something is not, I don't know, I feel something strange in the air. And yeah, for me professionally, it was a huge thing to be able to work on open source and also on open standards, not only on an institution like Oasis, but also on ISO, representing Brazil for some years on the committees. And I think that this balance between those two things are quite important for us. And I hope someday I'll be able to start talking more about this again, convincing people to take the work where we left and move this forward within the community. And it's good to see Brazilians start getting much more involved with open source. It's very good to be working on a company right now that is investing in open source and believes on open source, because it was basically created based on open source, and the founders used a lot of open source. So I think I remember the days where we had events with 10,000 people, 15,000 people talking about free software delivery in Brazil. And I miss those days, but I think that today it's much more part of people's daily based life, the dream we have. And I think we in Brazil don't have enough words to express how much we thank you to help us at that time. And, you know, help at Brazil, have people like Bruno that is here, that is a reference for everyone that we know here. And thank you so much, my friend. So if you want to say goodbye.
It's lovely to almost be back in Brazil again. Maybe one day I'll be able to get back. Who knows?
Yeah, I hope so, and I hope to be able to go to visit your restaurant, because you showed me the menu yesterday. It was quite exciting.
It's very, very well tuned for Brazilian tastes, I think. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. Nice to see you all.
Thank you, guys.